Welcome to Regent Park TV. I'm Kedar Ahmed, and today we bring you special coverage of an emergency press conference organized by the Shelter Housing Justice Network. Advocates urge the City of Toronto to expand emergency shelter spaces for unhoused individuals and to open community centers and private buildings, create 300 to 400 new shelter spaces by month's end, and establish cooling centers with surge capacity. The city's heat relief strategy includes a network of over 600 locations, but the advocates argue more immediate action is needed. For an in-depth look at the critical issues raised and the urgent calls for action, watch the full press conference documented by rptv reporter Fred Alvarado. Now, take it from here, Fred.
Okay, so hi everyone, thank you for coming today. My name is Lorraine. Today I am wearing the hat of a steering committee member with Shelter and Housing Justice Network, and we have called together this emergency press conference because things in the city around the state of homelessness is really, really dire. So today there's a thunderstorm watch, there is a heat wave across the city, and meanwhile, if you did actually try to call for a shelter bed, you have a 0.03% chance of getting a bed. So in May, for instance, on a daily average, there would be about 222 different people who would call central intake to try to get a bed. And out of 222, only 7 people would get matched. And that's just the people who try, and that's 0.03%. And meanwhile, what we see across the city as the heat is going on, as we have a thunderstorm happening, we see that the city has removed bus shelters so that people can't sit at Dundas and Sherbourne. There's no seating at the Eaton Centre because, God forbid, people, quote, loiter. Meanwhile, Toronto is spending millions on private security contracts like at Union Station to support vulnerable people. And now we have cops doing outreach in the downtown east. But my question is, what does that mean in terms of outreach? Because where are people being taken to when we know that shelters are full and there's no options? Meanwhile, residents across the city are complaining about encampments. They don't want shelters going up in the neighborhood, but my question is, well, where are people supposed to go? The city's own organization, Streets to Homes, well, they can't get people into homes. They can't even get people off the streets into shelters because there are no shelters. Across the street from us, we see 129 Peter Street, and now Streets to Homes is telling people that the quickest way they'll get access to supports is by lining up outside 129 Peter Street. And so whether it's the cold, whether it's the heat, homelessness is in a state of worsening crisis. And we're gathered here today because tomorrow the executive committee will meet and we are insisting that they do something immediately. Today we have about 5 speakers lined up who will speak about their experiences in trying to get people indoors, and hopefully the city will respond to hearing those statements. First, we're going to hear from Jenny Duffy. Jenny works at the Church of the Holy Trinity, the church behind the Eaton Centre, and she helps support unhoused people to access food, health services, mental health supports, and other key things. Jenny?
Hi everyone, my name is Jenny Duffy. I work at Church of the Holy Trinity, where we provide harm reduction services and other supportive services to communities facing houselessness, food insecurity, and facing extreme marginalization. I can tell you, we are located at Trinity Square, right behind the Eaton Centre, steps away from the entrance. The Eaton Centre is not an accessible cooling space for unhoused people. Malls are not an accessible, welcoming cooling space for unhoused people. People are routinely banned and removed from these spaces. This is simply not realistic. Same with swimming pools and wading pools. It is very normal for unhoused people to try and cool down in these spaces as directed by the city, only to have law enforcement called on them, only to be removed by security. So the city is sending unhoused people to spaces as part of their plan, only for them to get targeted even more. This is not acceptable, and we're all here today because it needs to change. This summer, there is intense heat. We are all feeling it. We are riding multiple heat waves. There's a heat warning today, and unhoused people, they are so vulnerable to heat-related injuries and illnesses. And these are fatal injuries, like heat stroke and even pneumonia. People don't tend to think of pneumonia in the summer, right? We tend to think of catching pneumonia in the winter. But actually, bacterial pneumonia is most commonly spread in late summer and fall. And it's really pervasive among people living in encampments who are in close quarters with each other, who face barriers and discrimination to accessing health services, and who don't have access to medication or spaces to rest and recover from these serious illnesses. So pneumonia is a big problem that we're seeing right now. Just last month, a beloved community member of ours died in his tent due to pneumonia. Pneumonia, a completely treatable illness. And in this summer heat, the inside of tents are like saunas. Imagine being inside of a sauna, being inside of a hot tent while you have any kind of breathing condition, any kind of lung infection. It is a death sentence for people. And it is completely unacceptable, like shame on this city for allowing people to suffer in these conditions, for allowing people to die of completely treatable illnesses, for allowing this to be a kind of dystopia where people are sleeping outside. We are here today because we're just calling out the obvious. It is obvious that this cooling plan is not realistic. And I can't believe that the people who wrote it would think that that actually works for people. We need the expansion of spaces. We need people to be able to access cooling spaces in the evenings, on weekends. We need people, unhoused people, to be welcomed and not turned away from these spaces. And we need emergency shelters for people. People can't keep just sleeping outside and everyone just calling this okay and normal and acceptable. We need change today. Thank you.
Thanks, Jenny. Yeah, homelessness is a death sentence, and we know actually that the median lifespan for a homeless person is half of that of a housed person in Toronto. Next, we will hear from Dr. Paige Homme. Dr. Paige is a family medicine resident in Toronto and the current chair of Health Providers Against Poverty. Dr. Paige has been part of the community-based organizing for many, many years as a health worker and as a resident of Toronto.
Good morning. My name is Dr. Paige Homme. I'm here also as the chair of the Health Providers Against Poverty. The egregious lack of housing and shelter is a public health emergency. People have nowhere to go, and so many more are living on a knife's edge. Nearly all of our health and shelter systems are pushed beyond capacity and beyond functioning. Every night, hundreds are left without a place to go, calling central intake, or forced to go to Peter Street, which is just across the street, but have to stay outside. No space for a respite center, a space to escape the heat, or in many cases, the torrential rain. This situation is not only untenable, it's deadly and it's dangerous. As a resident doctor, I'm constantly left at a complete loss in how to help. The moral distress is difficult to articulate. Patients who are not sick enough to be in hospital but still in need of weeks of rest and recuperation have nowhere to go, calling central intake in the hospital for days, or being discharged to Peter Street, which is really just another way of being discharged to the street. Families of newcomers, those who have recently been evicted from their home, people who are unsafe in their home due to violence or other reasons, people unable to afford rent or find accessible housing. All the myriad of ways our fellow neighbors, community members, and patients are pushed into unsafe and precarious living conditions. It's devastating to see the clear drop-off of our healthcare system right at the edges. I can't provide prescriptions for housing. I can't provide prescriptions for clean drinking water, prescriptions to live in safe and dignified housing. All I got is a 10-year wait list for housing and no shelter beds. What we have is go to Peter Street. Our housing crisis is a failing on a massive scale. Every time this is a federal issue. This is a provincial issue. This is what about the long-term issues? On and on and on. What we say is that people are suffering now. We say listen. Listen to the people in their communities who, despite the city's indifference to their suffering and their lives, create steadfast and creative ways to keep each other safe and to take care of each other. It is the work of community organizing that continually pushes for change and makes change. It's time for Mayor Olivia Chow and the Executive Committee to take immediate steps to address this crisis. Open any available city-owned space, community center, privately leased building like 311 Sherburne for emergency shelter for people. Plan to increase the capacity by at least 300 to 400 beds by the beginning of August. To actually open cooling centers, which used to be open but aren't anymore, with surge capacity for people to escape the heat. And implement a moratorium on encampment evictions, which will also help people stay more safe. The city cannot afford to wait any longer. They must act now to save people.
Homelessness is a public health emergency. As Dr. Paige alluded to, this current cooling center, heat relief network mess does not actually work. Because what this network says is go online and put in your address and look for the closest place where there is air conditioning. So that might be a mall, it might be a swimming pool, but let me tell you, none of the people that I work with outside are going swimming to cool off. Malls close at a certain time, but heat waves don't just stop at 5 p.m. when libraries close. The heat relief network does not work, and we actually need respite spaces. We're going to hear more from Greg Cook. Greg has been an outreach worker and drop-in worker in the downtown east for over 15 years. He's currently an outreach worker at Sanctuary and is on the steering committee of the Shelter and Housing Justice Network, and he recently co-edited the book Displacement City with Cathy Crowe.
I'm an outreach worker at Sanctuary, and I'm also on the steering committee of Shelter and Housing Justice Network. As my colleagues have been saying, the shelters are full, encampment evictions continue to happen in parks and under bridges. People have nowhere to go during extreme weather. The city isn't even doing the bare minimum. What does this look like? People like Dave, who was in his 50s, dying from pneumonia after being stuck in a tent during a heat wave in June. A young black man calling dozens and dozens of times for months trying to get a shelter bed because when he's stuck outside, the police are continually harassing him. Profound fear of many unhoused people as gentrifiers throw fruit, whole pieces of fruit, and also cans of tomato sauce at people's tents from up sky-high condos. City workers still putting time and money towards erecting fences around parks to keep people from erecting survival structures. We don't need grass remediation, we need housing people can afford. We need a mayor that prioritizes shelter beds, cooling centers, rather than pouring more and more money into clearing encampments, and the ever-growing infrastructure of displacement. We need a mayor that builds. Since Mayor Chow has been in office, the primary strategy that the city has had to increase shelter space is to move beds and cots closer together in shelters, reintroduce bunk beds, and cram beds into common areas. Treating people like sardines is unsafe and inhumane. We must get rid of bunk beds in shelters. People deserve at least 2 meters spacing at the minimum. On top of this problematic practice in the city is failing to use the money that is sitting in this year's budget to add shelter beds. The city has budgeted an additional 800 or so beds on top of the current number. We need those beds immediately. What is Mayor Chow waiting for? It is the middle of July. The budget was passed months ago. We need cooling centers immediately. We need them in Etobicoke, Scarborough, North York, and downtown. The city must open community centers as an emergency measure immediately. We demand a plan to add hundreds more shelter beds by the end of the month. We demand a moratorium on encampment evictions. Where are people to go? People must be allowed to exist somewhere. Thank you.
Treating people as sardines is inhumane, And that feels so obvious. Like, we live in a city that talks about, oh, housing is a human right. But yet in reality, it seems like poor people are just not seen human enough to deserve to take up space. The budget was passed months ago, and so what are we waiting for? And switching hats for a quick second, as somebody who sometimes works up in Willowdale, the conversation around homelessness sometimes is framed as a downtown issue. But in reality, homelessness is across the city. We are seeing more and more people move outside of the core because of gentrification into Willowdale, into Scarborough, into Rexdale, Etobicoke, and there are even less resources out there for people. What are we waiting for? And sometimes the conversation is framed as this new thing, the housing crisis, but we know it's not new. And now we have Gaetan to speak to this reality. Not that I'm calling him old, but Gaetan has been around for a long time frontline outreach worker and activist who will speak to the historical context of how we got here. And he is also the founder and co-member of 235.
My name is Gaetan, a member of 235 Back. I'm going to throw a name out for you, and Eugene Upper. I don't know how many people remember the name Eugene Upper, but one person who should remember Eugene Upper, the name Eugene Upper, is Mayor Olivia Chow. And why should she know that name? Because in the beginning of 1996, 3 men froze to death on our streets. And I remember Olivia and Jack Layton speaking out about the fact that one night they were walking by a bus shelter and they saw a man on Spadina, just a few blocks from where they lived, and later on found out the next day that the man had frozen to death. And Olivia and Jack called for an inquest into those deaths. But not only that, at that time, the city opened up Moss Park Armories. Hundreds of people filled the Moss Park Armories. And the reason I mention the freezing death is because right now, Olivia Chow has a lot of power to deal with what we're seeing and what people are talking about today. The fact that on a nightly basis, there are people, hundreds of people, who walk these streets and don't know where they're going to stay. There's no safe place for them to go. Often when I get out, when I live at Queen's-Quay in Bathurst, when I come out in the morning, there are people sleeping in the stairwell where I live. There are countless stories like this. It is inhumane to have a situation like that where people are forced to wait outside these doors looking for a bed. That's inhumane, it's cruel. These people are being abandoned. It's dangerous. People will die. And they will die like they died in 1996. Why are we still talking about this now, today? Almost, 30 years later almost. It has to stop. And one way of dealing with that is to make sure that tomorrow, that you open up something in the downtown core, wherever you need to open it up, whether it's the Moss Park Armories, Metro Hall, Fort York Armories, all of those places have been used historically in times of crisis. So why are we not doing that? Why is Olivia Chow and council not doing that? So we have to do that. We can't allow a situation where people are left. There's an expression in French, I don't know what it is in English. On laisse le monde crever dans la rue. We let people die on these streets. And we hear nothing from the bureaucrats who are supposed to do that. The last thing I'll say, we have the World Cup coming to town in 2026. $380 million. And just recently they talked about $80 million that they have to find somewhere. And they're going to find that money. We're talking about our people. People that these workers and I, when we walk down the streets, we see them, and everybody in this city. When you walk down the street, you see the people. You'll see them on grates. How the hell can you have a situation where you have still people on grates? You know, at Victoria and Green Street. I know people who died on these grates 30 years ago. Why does that situation still exist? So we have to act now. And thank you for those workers to come out and speak about what they're seeing.
I really appreciated Paige Homme's mentioning of how this is a crisis that has worsened over the last number of decades. Back in the 90s, Mayor Chow stepped up to do something about it. So what is she going to do about it now? And as we've been standing here for the last 20 minutes or so, one of my colleagues was across the street at 129 Peter Street trying to get someone a shelter bed today. And guess what? There are no shelter beds. So now they're just waiting inside to wait to see if somebody in that building can find a shelter bed somewhere in the city for that person. But she and this person was the last person to get in to wait for a shelter bed because now the referral space is full. And so everybody else who shows up here to look for a shelter bed, well, they're just gonna have to wait outside until they can get inside to wait to find a shelter bed somewhere. Nobody wants to wait in this rain, so you know what? If you see some folks napping on the subway today, let them be. If you see people staying dry in a coffee shop, maybe in your building stairwell, maybe in a library or at the mall, please let them be because there are no other options. And finally, we will hear from Nadine Casemore. Nadine is an outreach specialist and a harm reduction worker based in the downtown east. She's currently the Director of Strategic Planning for the Street Outreach Team at Maggie's Toronto Sex Worker Action Project.
Good afternoon. My name is Nadine Casemore. I am the Director of Strategic Planning for the Street Outreach Team at Maggie's Toronto Sex Workers Action Project. I'm here to talk to you today about our experience serving individuals experiencing homelessness, poverty, substance use, and those engaged in sex work in the downtown east. I'm also here today to express the need for cooling centers and more shelter spaces. Myself and my team constantly struggle with the knowledge that we are limited in what we can offer in the face of some of the worst conditions for folks experiencing homelessness in Toronto to date. At Maggie's, we prioritize hiring folks that have lived experience with the issues faced by community members, and yet we continue to be blown away by the lack of resources offered by the city to this population, specifically in the summer. The heat waves, the displacement due to events and tourism, the criminalization that our folks are exposed to, the evictions, the NIMBYism, all of this feels insurmountable. We are unable to secure shelter spaces or offer any indoor space where folks can cool down, specifically for those who have been criminalized and barred from accessing public spaces such as malls or community centers. Despite people experiencing homelessness in Toronto being one of the most researched populations, services continue to be designed based on assumptions rather than what has been directly told. We are saying today, and we are telling today, that we need more spaces, we need more cooling centers, we need more resources. We are telling you that. Please hear us. We need more shelter spaces, including hotels, immediately. The loss of life and complications caused by the extreme heat is staggering. In my experience, the high heat is far more damaging than the below zero temperatures because there's no recourse other than going inside or accessing something cold to lower your body temperature. You cannot cool yourself down. Due to systemic barriers, many of our folks deal with complex health issues that go unaddressed or take medications that make them more vulnerable to the heat. In conjunction with substance use, these conditions are deadly. As workers that engage with these communities on a regular basis, the dwindling options to get inside are a sore spot for us. We want nothing more than to be able to offer a meaningful intervention when we hear about grievous violence, sexual assault, or grief so severe after watching dozens of friends pass away without any acknowledgement from the city or the public. People need spaces to exist in that belong to them. We need to acknowledge that by deeming certain folks do not belong in public spaces creates a continuum of criminalization that further cripples our communities. At this moment, I have no recourse if somebody wants to go inside. None. We need action, and we need it now. Thank you.
Regent just said, we have services that are designed based on assumptions. My curiosity to the people who developed this heat relief network, did they actually talk to people who are outside to be like, hey, does this heat relief network make sense for you? My assumption is no. In fact, all of the things that exist right now are often implemented by people who are steps removed from actually being unhoused, from people who are actually working with people who are unhoused. And that's why these services don't work. So as I mentioned earlier, we have a coworker with somebody trying to get a shelter bed right now. And this is just somebody who tried. If you just look on the City of Toronto's data sets, you'll see again in May, the daily average in May was that 222 different people would try to call central intake for a bed. And out of 222, only 7 people would get a bed. That's a 0.03% chance. It's basically impossible to get a shelter bed. And that's just the people who try. So what are people supposed to do? Where are people supposed to go? You know, the city says, hey, it's a heat wave, go inside, stay indoors, make sure to be air conditioned. Well, where are people supposed to go? Because there's a bunch of people who are gonna have to wait outside in this rain to try to get a shelter bed somewhere. Homelessness is a life or death emergency, and if you've never stopped by the Homeless Memorial, I highly encourage you to. The second Tuesday of every month at the Church of the Holy Trinity behind the Eaton Center. There are names, lists and lists of names of people who have died on the street from preventable things. Our friend Dave died from pneumonia. People dying from pneumonia in a city like Toronto is absolutely unacceptable. And I urge the city and the executive committee to do something about it. Or maybe they're the ones that should make the phone calls to loved ones and say, hey, you know what, your son, your daughter died on the streets because I chose to spend money on the World Cup. I chose to spend money on policing instead of actual solutions. Maybe that's what the executive committee should consider doing moving forward. The committee is meeting tomorrow, and the group of us here are insisting that they open any city-owned spaces like community centers or lease private buildings like the one at 311 Sherbourne as temporary measures for shelter. We're asking them to present a plan, not a 10-year plan, but an immediate plan to increase the immediate capacity for emergency shelter spaces by at least 300 to 400. We're insisting that they open cooling centers today, not next summer, but today, and also have surge capacity for extreme heat. In fact, these spaces should be inclement weather respites because we need respites not just in the middle of summer, but we need them in the middle of winter. We need them in the fall when we get storm warnings. People need respites all year round. And we're also insisting that they stop evicting encampments. And sometimes we hear language like remediation, but we know what that means. Remediation means fencing, means keeping people out of the space. Do not displace encampments when people have no other options. The executive committee is meeting tomorrow, and we are looking forward to seeing what comes out of it. All media who are here today, the speakers are happy to speak with you, but I would also think it would be important to speak with all of the other people who showed up today who might not necessarily be workers, but they're people in the city who care about this, and I think their voices need to be heard too. So please do go speak with all those people. Thank you for coming today.
My name is Saleh Sheikh, and I come usually here twice a week to help support the newcomers, helping to find if they're going to the shelters. Usually I work with a group called Crisis in Our City. We help find resources, access information in the city, and usually that's why I'm here. So when I heard about the press conference, I came to support this group hosting that. And we're here because, you know, this crisis has been here from last year, and they say they're solving it, but it's too little, too slow, you know? Things not happening fast enough, so we're trying to show support. I think the city need, I'm not gonna say that they have spent this much for that budget. They have the budget for the housing and for the newcomers they're coming. They just need to work fast. But last year it took them like 9 months to refund the churches that started in the beginning. Now we're trying to get housing and shelter. They're gonna start working after 6 months from now maybe, but they can start doing that. So that's why we keep pushing to make things happen faster. And I think that's what we keep doing. Like we said, we're here in Regent Park and downtown. There is 2 shelters there. There is the Good Shepherd and Maxwell Megan, and they're filled with refugees. In the beginning, there was like 4 in a room. Now it became like 10 in a room. And there are shelters, hotels. So we need to find housing faster, give them job opportunity so they can go out of the shelter system and find their own housing. The city needs to put the plan now, not tomorrow, not 2 months from now.
Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Also follow us on social media, and for more information, check out our website.